Blog Talk Radio.
He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High God shall abide in His grace, and he that walketh through the valley of death shall in no wise be entangled. By God's hand you shall be kept. So if I go into the heavens, He knows. If I go into the deepest depths, He knows. So no matter what may come my way, I'm covered by His blood. Even when Satan seems to rage from His hand, I'm hidden safe. I'm in His safety, dwell in His safety, the safety of the Lord. Nothing can stop me. Devil, you should have killed me while you had the chance. You don't even harm me. I'm in the safety. I'm in the safety of the Lord. I'm yes, I am. I dwell in the safety, the safety. Bless your name, oh God. Yes, I do. The safety of the He is the captain. He's the captain of my soul. He builds a fortress all around me, and He keeps me from all harm. When the storm of life began, I run into so much. Oh, He is the captain. He is the captain of my soul. He builds a fortress all around me, all around me, and He keeps me from when the storm of life is. let me down now. I rest in Him. 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 He never lets me fall. He covers me. He covers me. He has 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 me to say, thank you, Jesus. Hallelujah. Woo! I'm in His mighty. He hides me. Till I get myself together, He hides me. He covers me. All I have to do is call on His name and He covers me. I'm in His safety. Sometimes you just have to go to Him as humble as a lamb. You wonder how I can stay in His safety? Because He's God.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Friday night's edition of Center Stage. I'm Kheri, Hines, your host. Thank you for joining us for what should be another very interesting show. Tonight we will explore the topic Ebola Outbreak, a real threat or staged scare tactic. We will look at the recent activity surrounding the Ebola outbreak and see why so many feel there's more to this story. Some conspiracy theorists are speculating the Ebola virus is man-made right here in the U.S. in a laboratory specifically for the use of depopulation as part of Agenda 21. Also, in the second hour, we'll look at updates in the Mike Brown case and what's going on in Ferguson. And if time permits, we want to look at all the recent abuse cases that are popping up in the NFL. So before we begin, we want to remind you that the views and opinions of our guests do not necessarily reflect that of Center Stage, the host, or advertisers. And we've got a great panel tonight, y'all. Listen, I'm very excited about tonight's show because back for the second time, and we enjoyed her so much, is Mary Neal, even though I don't see her on the phone line yet. And if she would press 1 for some reason, I'm not finding her number on the board. And Mary is the host of Incarcerated Mentally Ill, and she's also an activist. The second name, and I've already apologized in advance. I may butcher it, but I'm going to do my best. Ivy Yummy, Isaac, as a Kiwi. I'm sorry. A certificate. I'm going to try this. And I told him in advance, I said, listen, I'm going to do my best. But my gosh, this is a difficult name. His name is Abiyomi Isaac Kiwe, and he's the editor of Pan-African Newswire. And normally, y'all know my co-host, Christopher Bones. He's an activist and organizer. Mr. A.J. Houston, he's a poet, author, and activist. And last but not least is Mr. Mark Daniel. He's an activist and a blogger with Global Political Awakening. Good evening, everyone. Let me see if I can open everybody's phone line. And welcome to Center Stage tonight.
Okay. Good evening, Kheri, and all the panel.
Good evening. Mary, did I find you on the phone line?
I am here.
Great. Good evening, everyone.
Yeah, good evening. How y'all doing?
Good. Okay, and I see I have Mr. Abayami. Did I open your phone line?
Yes, I'm here.
Good evening. Okay, so good evening, everyone. Tonight we're going to talk about Ebola here in the first hour. And there's so many things going on in that particular story about Ebola. Who wants to start us off? First of all, I'd like to ask everyone the question. In my title, I asked was Ebola. Is the outbreak real, or is it a scare tactic? Is it a staged event to scare us all? Anybody want to start off? What do you all think? We'll start with Mary Neal so nobody's jumping in. The lady who's the lady on the panel.
Well, thank you, Ms. Hines. I want you to know that I think Ebola is both real and it's a very effective scare tactic. So I think that Ebola virus is both of those. These people who have died in Africa and other places, they really died. And this is not the first outbreak of Ebola that has happened, especially in Africa. So we know that it's real. However, I do think that it is also a scare tactic. It is something to divert attention from more clear and present dangers. We have a number of clear and present dangers in the USA that generally involve our government to some extent and oppression by the government. And I think that sometimes the government seeks to divert attention from itself, especially at election time, by coming up with these scare tactics, as you say, that Ebola might be a part of. So that's my opinion that it's both. It's both real and it is also used as a diversionary tool.
Wow. Mr. Ivy Conway, what do you think?
Yeah, I would agree in the sense that it is a virus that can be traced back to 1976. There's been periodic outbreaks, principally in Central Africa, over the last 38 years. This is the largest documented outbreak since the 1976 identification. And according to the news reports, over 4,000 cases have been documented, and there's been in excess of 2,000 deaths. So it is a real threat, and it is an effort at this point to try to contain the virus and also to eradicate it. There are some experimental drugs that are being utilized for that purpose, but they're still in the infancy stage in regard to developing a vaccine to eradicate the virus or either to control it. I think the reason why it has spread so rapidly in several West African states, being Guinea, Conakry, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, and there have also been cases in Nigeria and Senegal as well, is that there is a situation where there is a huge deficit in medical infrastructure, the need for scientific research, accumulation of data about infections and patterns of infection, and that, in my opinion, is a way in which this outbreak can spread rapidly if there's not the necessary medical infrastructure to contain it. So I think in regard to how it is being portrayed, principally in the Western media and also the media in Africa, it has engendered a considerable amount of fear to the extent that the U.S. government at this point is taking a militarized response to the outbreak. President Obama announced he was sending 3,000 troops to various West African countries, ostensibly to fight against the virus, but that remains to be seen, since the U.S. does have an overall agenda of fostering militarization in Africa.
Agent Houston, real threat or pure tactic?
Well, I have to agree with everybody. It's actually both. But the real problem is the present strain was traced back to Atlanta, where they brought the Americans back to, and the Americans were healed. So America has a history of trying out different things in different areas and different regions of the world to show that they can go and heal somebody, even if they're the one that caused it. So I think it's a real scare, but I think the tactic is for them to next year to be selling Ebola shots at Walgreens.
Oh.
Don't get Ebola by your shot at Walgreens next to the flu shot.
Oh. So you think they're going to commercialize it, and basically it's just going to be a moneymaker for the vaccine? But do you think that's going to be
so, because
or after they kill a bunch of people? I'm sorry?
I'm saying if the same virus, because they can trace different traits of the virus, different genes in the virus back to where it was originated, and it was originated in Atlanta, the same place where they brought the American back, the first one. Yeah. So how can you come back to the place where it came from, but the virus was in another place where you were?
Yeah.
So it had to be some type of experiment from the beginning. It just got out of hand. I think people think they can control so many things. And when they don't tell the whole truth.
Absolutely. And, Kheri, I think the panel, right off the bat, we're on to the background and backdrop that a lot of people don't understand, just like AJ saying from the scientific point of view. Yes, it is a actual, realistic virus that has deadly implications. But like AJ was saying, the CDC and just about any medical or research journal that you look at, they will tell you that in terms of the so-called origin, being Africa and Republic of the Congo and so forth, that the so-called monkeys, the original, as they're saying, host, where it came from, was supposed to be monkeys, apes, gorillas, and the fruit bats. Now, the reason that is important is that if you look in any research literature, it will tell you that basically the apes or the animals that were deemed accidental hosts, meaning that they catch disease and then they pass it along, but they're not the initial reservoir source that produces the virus. So, okay, we go back to AIDS. They said the same thing, and people have to catch that. Same thing about AIDS in terms of from the monkeys, from the so forth, from the fruit bats. Now, my thought would be, why would you have to spend more money developing vaccines and research to combat the disease versus going back to where it's supposed to be starting from? In other words, you could inoculate gorillas and in a general sense, and the other secondary way that they said that Ebola and HIV came about was through people eating. It was through the pigs that they eat, the bats that they cook them as a delicacy, and so forth. But when you cook meat, gorilla meat, bat meat, you kill the virus. They're saying it's the handling of it. Well, that's not necessarily true, because the way that it spreads is through bodily fluids. So it's not conspiracy. When you think about that, that means what AJ is saying, in one shape or form, it had to come from some place and then be initially put or injected or put into livestock or food that the people eat for them to get it in the first place. So the implications are large in terms of pharmaceutical profit off of a vaccine that will, in fact, work, because it's in a laboratory. Basically, they can narrow down what will kill the virus or what will slow the virus. So I think people have to be aware that this is the same guy that AIDS came from.
Mark Daniel, Real threat
Hello,
or
Kheri. Well, let me first begin by saying that I'm a proud conspiracy theorist. And secondly, I agree with the comments that have already been made that this is both a real threat. The Ebola virus is a real threat. I'm deeply concerned about the people in Africa, especially right now, who recognize that there is a depopulation agenda. They may not fully understand what's going on, but there are some fears that they have, and they're legitimate fears. And rather than acknowledging those fears and having the right people on the ground there that don't have nefarious intentions helping them, they're stuck in a very, very difficult predicament. And that's what has resulted in the kidnapping and murder of some people that are there on the ground, journalists and scientists who are there. I'm not sure if they're there for the right reasons or not. But let me begin by saying that there is a quote that I'd like to read you from Henry Kissinger. Well, let me begin with another guy. His name's Dr. Eric Pianka, and he's an award-winning scientist with the University of Texas. He's an evolutionary ecologist and lizard expert, and he showed solutions for reducing the world's population to an audience on population control. And he said, and I quote, "War and famine would not do. Instead, disease offered the most efficient and fastest way to kill the billions that must soon die if the population crisis is to be solved. AIDS is not an effective killer because it's too slow. My favorite candidate for eliminating 90% of the world's population is airborne Ebola arrested, because it is both highly lethal and it kills in days instead of years. We've got airborne diseases with 90% mortality in humans, killing humans. Think about that. The bird flu's good too. For everyone who survives, he will have to bury 9. Now, that's a quote from a very well-respected, or at least before he made these comments, and they were publicized by people in the alternative media, well-respected scientist with the University of Texas. Now, just because you don't know you have cancer doesn't mean you don't have it. Simply because one is unaware of the depopulation quotes and intentions of the world's most important leaders and institutions does not mean that the plans are not being implemented to do such a thing. When so many influential leaders speak about the need to depopulate the world, we need to be paying attention to their actions. And we need to be looking for clues that the agenda is underway in order that we can best protect ourselves. The depopulation agenda is being legitimized in print by various global think tank groups as a means to deindustrialize the planet in order to save it from the overuse of fossil fuels. Further, the depopulation agenda is being used as an excuse to protect the planet's inhabitants from a dwindling food source. This is one of the biggest lies being perpetrated upon the people. A growing population base is not causing the planet to run out of food. And there's lots of research and information out there for people to look for, and all you need to look at is the depopulation agenda. Just do a Google search of that, and you can find lots of good information. The only other thing I wanted to mention to you is Henry Kissinger. Now, there's a National Security Study Memorandum 200 that came out on December 10th, 1974, and it was issued by the United States National Security Council under the direction of Henry Kissinger. It was adopted as official U.S. policy by President Gerald Ford in November 1975, which coincides with Abiami's comments about when all this got started. It was originally classified but was later declassified and obtained by researchers in the early 90s. The findings of that memorandum, National Security Memorandum 200, states the basic thesis of the memorandum was that the population growth in the least developed countries, what they call LDCs, is a concern to U.S. national security because it would tend to risk civil unrest and political instability in countries that had a high potential for economic development. The policy gives paramount importance to population control measures and the promotion of contraception among 13 populous countries. This is to control rapid population growth, which the U.S. deems inimical to the socio-political and economic growth of these countries and to the national interest of the United States, since the U.S. economy will require large and increasing amounts of minerals from abroad. And these countries can produce a destabilizing opposition forces against the United States. It recommends that U.S. leadership influenced national leaders, and that improved worldwide support for population-related efforts should be sought through increased emphasis on mass media and other population, education, and motivation programs by and this is key, by the United Nations, USIA, and USAID. Now, the countries named, and I'm going to stop here, is India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Indonesia, Thailand, the Philippines, Turkey, Nigeria, Egypt, Ethiopia, Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil. These countries are projected to create 47% of all world population growth. So, and it goes on, and you can just simply search on Google for the National Security Study Memorandum 200. This is well documented. This is not a conspiracy theory. It's a conspiracy fact.
So if the whole purpose of Ebola is I'm sorry, go ahead. Was that Mary Neal? Did I interrupt somebody, or is somebody's line open?
No, it sounds like there's some background noise on somebody's line that's interfering with the,
Yeah, somebody's got some background noise. But it's the whole issue of Ebola is, as I said in the intro, about depopulation. What can the people do? I mean, a lot of people in Africa are afraid of vaccines, and I believe rightly so. But what else can be done? Say you don't take the vaccine that they offer, then what? I mean, what can you do? Isaac Highway.
Well, right now, there's no vaccines that have basically been approved by the FDA. In terms of what people can do, this kind of twofold. The first thing is that you have to remember, I don't remember, I know I've stated before, the amount of money that the U.S. government has given the Canadian pharmaceutical company that developed the vaccine called ZMapp. What people have to understand is that this is something where they take the live attenuated, basically they take part of the strain, they inject it into a tobacco plant to get the vaccine that they then inject into people. Part of what is happening, if people can kind of put two and two together, is that they're using the third world country or impoverished areas as test subjects. People have to, I mean, once you use lab rats, lab animals, and they even use primates for the test, then they have to take it and they have to try it on people. Now, there would probably be not conspiracy theory, but conspiracy fact if you just went in and you placated people and you injected people in the Congo with that. So the easier way to do that is basically put it into the livestock. Then that way when the people eat it, it's easily transmitted because some people don't really cook their food all the way. Some people don't cook their food at all, and they eat it. And you more than likely 90 percentile you will contract Ebola. So that's the first thing. What the poor people can do is that it has already been proven by the CDC. If people have better hygiene in terms of their livestock, if they're more judicious in cleaning, using chemicals that would basically keep the areas more clean, and then be more selective in what they were basically feeding those livestock. That alone would probably almost cut the spread of Ebola in half. That's already proven, so that's an easy fix. But I think people are so paralyzed, like you're saying, that I don't think people understand the implications. And my thing is, I always like to look at not just the symptom, but the problem. And if you trace it back, and it costs maybe only millions versus billions, why wouldn't you take the lesser of the two evils or the lesser of the two roads to do that? Well, because then that would mean that the implication of the bidders that are already out there that will then be able to make the vaccine, it probably dwarfs the money that they would spend to eradicate it, or at least make it not like a pandemic or epidemic. But there's so much money to be made, they're using poor people as test pilots, and once they essentially not just perfect it, but get the FDA to buy off on it, there's no turning back with that at that point, because the money will supersede human value.
See, I'm scratching my head because I think right now Sierra Leone is in lockdown, or basically they're under martial law for the next 3 days. And you know, if what you said is true, what they're saying here that they're going to give as a I don't know, a fix for it is crazy. Basically, everybody, we're talking about some 6 million people are confined basically to their homes for 3 days, while they have volunteers going by giving you soap, I guess to wash your hands and body or whatever, and give you some information about Ebola. But, you know, what you said is true. Just basic soap is not going to be the fix that's needed, to stop the spread of Ebola.
Right, and see, here's the other thing, and the other issue about Ebola is in its very concentrated original state, is the molecule is very large. Unlike some others, like influenza, is a smaller type of viral entity. So the difference is, the smaller the entity, the easier it is to spread. So you don't have to be quarantined or confined, because that's more aerosolized or airborne. The myth about Ebola is that basically you just sneeze on somebody and they get it. No, it doesn't work like that. The molecule is so big that it needs time to basically set up shop. So therefore, you almost have to keep people in closer quarters for a certain period of time before that particular viral entity can be contracted. So in other words, if you put it in the food,
if you're confining them to small spaces for 3 days, straight, isn't that exactly what you're saying?
And that's what I'm saying. That's part of that's kind of part of the design, because the molecule is so big, and if you quarantine people, it would almost be better not to quarantine people than to quarantine them, because when you do that, then you give rise to that larger molecule having the decreased space to spread. The more you spread it out, and because Ebola does not live long on its own without a host. So pretty much the further people are apart, it will die quicker than it will live. But a smaller viral will live longer because it's in the air. And that's another fear tactic, because it has not been proven or established that it's basically aerosolized or in the air.
So basically, them implementing martial law, came into play basically because the UN basically said that, there's been 5,300 people affected, mostly in Sierra Leone and Guinea and Liberia. So basically, they decided that was a threat to world peace. So, that's what the UN is using, let's just say that, for the reason to put Sierra Leone under martial law. So now, if what you're saying is true, Chris, that means that they're probably going to make the virus worse in 3 days than it was 3 days before the 3 days before they started the martial law there, which is crazy. But the people are totally without any recourse, because once they call martial law on you, what can you do? Nothing.
Well, and they're also not talking about taking the experimental vaccines and utilizing it on the people. So if you're going to keep me all boxed in, what's the end result? Other than I'm going to contract it, and at some point I'm going to either get ill, deathly ill, or I'm going to die. So I'm trying to see the logic. If I'm going to quarantine, the minimum that I would do is say, hey, we have an experimental drug that has some success in clinical trials. So this is the only thing that we have available to us to use. But I'm not hearing anything from any leadership in that area saying what is the fix or what they're going to do to those people who are quarantined. And I'm telling you now, they don't use the experimental vaccines, the people are going to die. slowly.
Has anybody even determined if that drug ZMapp, which was used on Dr. Kent Brantley and that other American missionary that was over there, they had to come back and be treated here in the States, which got better. Both of them are out of the hospital, out of Emory Hospital, and doing fine. That said, is that ZMapp treatment, I think it's called ZMapp, let me say it correctly.
Yes, it's ZMAPP. Kheri, I can tell you right off the bat, if that was the case and the physicians who were allegedly infected are now miraculously recovering when they've given that drug to other individuals that were in the same stages of the Ebola infection and they did not live, then I would also say that whatever Magic Johnson was using for AIDS, then everybody who has AIDS should be getting, because for him to so-called have full-blown AIDS and to still be walking around, when I've seen people in the clinic that didn't even have it to the same degree that he did, where their immune system was compromised, then we need to be talking to Magic Johnson about what he took.
But do we know if ZMapp works on African people? Because aren't there some masks that work on certain groups and don't work on other groups? Anybody?
Well, yes, there is. But keep in mind that we have to kind of take what the mainstream white media is telling us. And sometimes what happens is that people used to, Dick Gregory made this point, 1960s, 1970s, early 80s, basically you had 4 or 5 news networks. And pretty much what they told the American public, people went with. Now you have underground radio, you got blog radio, you got international radios that are not controlled by those wings or those entities. So there's more of a flow of information. And I will say that if it was not for other than mainstream medias, people would pretty much be zombies because they believe, some even my own family, and I did too, until you really start turning those stones over and looking at the kinks in the armor. A lot of people, if you told them just in general that Ebola was a virus that was created in the lab in Atlanta, and then they determined that they strategically they were going to place it in certain areas, tend to be poor indigenous population, to see, in fact, what they already knew would happen in the lab among now human test subjects. Then to take the same produced vaccine to see the efficacy of what it would do. When you then ask about syphilis and the Tuskegee, when you remind people of that, that was even done on a small scale. But if you can imagine that now the technology can do it on a larger scale, people want to call you crazy because they don't think that there would be elements within the government that would basically support that. But they do it every day. And then the second thing is that in terms of warfare, what better way to have a chemical or a dirty bomb produced than to have something, I mean, we're talking beyond the nuclear bomb, the A-bomb. This is something that you don't even have to worry about once you drop it because it's going to kill people.
Well, let's be clear. We're speaking specifically now about Africa, but we here in the States are equally as susceptible because we've had cases that came into Atlanta. And wasn't there recently a case, Mary, where it went into Nebraska? Didn't they take a case into Nebraska this week?
I think that they delivered people who had been treating people in Africa in various hospitals. And that was done by, as I understand it, President Obama. I'm glad you came back to me because I want to say that if I were everybody in America, I would be very skeptical about any kind of vaccine, okay? Because if you can recall, they were thinking about enforced vaccine for the H1N1 endemic. And when they got around to trying to force our healthcare providers, doctors and nurses, to take the H1N1 vaccine, our doctors and nurses refused, and they sued because they wanted to be able to fire them if they refuse to take the vaccine. So the doctors and nurses sued, and the government backed down. And it was later discovered that there was no H1N1 endemic. They just wanted to sell that vaccine. There are people who believe that vaccines may be the mechanism for depopulation. I'm one of those. I believe the vaccine that will be offered in connection with Ebola, a vaccine has to give you a little bit of the disease. So say you're walking around in a country where you got 10,000 people with Ebola. You have a very minute chance of contracting Ebola just because 10,000 people have it. But if you go and stick your arm out and get a vaccine and get some of the Ebola in you, then to my idea, you have upped your chances significantly. So to my idea, anybody who came to me with a needle and said, here's your Ebola vaccine, I would run, and if I couldn't run, we'd fight with whatever I could find. Now, I want you to know that some years ago, and this will be quick, I found online when I was researching enforced H1N1 vaccines, I found a question at Yahoo Answers that was written by someone using the pseudonym Tiebreaker. This was written at Yahoo Answers in late May 2008. We were in the middle of a heated campaign. This person used the pseudonym Tiebreaker. Tiebreaker wrote, hypothetical situation, might help me in smaller matters. Say you're the leader of a country. It flourished for a while, but it's fallen into desperate times. The population is growing very rapidly. The amount of babies being born is at the highest rate it's ever been, and immigrants are flooding the land. The food is extremely scarce, and if this keeps up, you'll go bankrupt. The people would literally have to eat each other to survive. You have the option of enforcing a vaccine that could ultimately weed out the weak and leave the strong ill but alive. This is your only option to survive. What choice do you make? Is it more morally correct to ensure a few some survival, or to not cross the line of inhumanity at the cost of everything? In this instance, the strong will get better. Life will go on, but at a dramatically reduced populace. The question remains. That was posted by Tiebreaker in 2008. Now let's examine this. Tiebreaker predicted a time when immigrants would flood the land, and that's happening now. We have immigrants from Central America flooding America through the Texas border. Also, he said that food would be extremely scarce. Now, we know that we have chemical companies that are insisting that American farmers buy their seeds only from them. In fact, they have patented God's seeds. And also, they're putting these chemicals, which have cancerous agents, in all of our food almost. And so this Tiebreaker predicted that food would get extremely scarce. And then he also predicted that there would be a vaccine that he could enforce on the people. And the main reason for enforcing this vaccine would be population control, or rather depopulation. So I just want everybody to be aware that this was written in 2008 by Tiebreaker, and you can go to my blog, Free Speak blog, or you can put in my name, Mary Neal. I am very interested in depopulation and how it would be carried out in the United States of America. I live in Georgia, where the CDC is, and I also live in Georgia, where the Georgia Guidestones are. And I want you to know that according to Agenda 21, there are individuals who are interested in reducing America's population from 350 million down to 500 million. And so that can only be done by famine, by harping, that's weather control, and also by releasing disease. And vaccines are one way to release disease. So be aware of that. I want you to know that we've had earthquakes in areas that have never had earthquakes in our known history. We've had earthquakes in diverse places, like the Bible says the end days will be. But I don't think the earthquakes are naturally occurring earthquakes. As a matter of fact, the seismographs or whatever they are show that they're not. They're due to underground explosions by that chemical dynamite. So they're doing what they call fracking the earth.
Well, Mary, I think you're just crazy.
Thank you.
Mary is great. And Mary, I think they call that HARP. Is that a HARP program that you're referring to when you're talking about weather modification?
The HARP?
Yeah,
H-A-A-R-P.
Right.
H-A-A-R-P. So I think that these elitists have it in for us. I think they intend to attack America by harping, by some kind of depopulation vaccine, and also by contaminating our food supply. And all three of those, if you think about it, all three of those are already underway. So we have the deadly disease now that Tiebreaker wrote about. We also have harping already happening because we have the people pouring liquid dynamite into the ground, and they call that fracking. And we also have attacks on our food supply. I hope that people remember that they have such control over the wildlife that they can spray something and it kills all of a certain type of bird. They can pour something in the ocean and only a certain type of fish will rise up. That is called genetic warfare, biological warfare that only attacks a specific brand of animals. And so I think that anything they can do with animals in the animal kingdom can also be done to people. I think that it is possible to manufacture germs that will leave a certain race standing but take out a particular race. I think it is entirely possible. As a matter of fact, and this will be my last comment, I know that this happened with AIDS virus because it was found that Caucasian people who had lived through the Black Plague that ran through Europe during the Dark Ages, that's the Black Plague, the people who descended from individuals who lived through the Black Plague had an intolerance. They had in other words, they had like a natural vaccine in their bodies against the AIDS virus. So this was Caucasian people who descended from individuals who lived through the Black Plague, had a natural vaccine against AIDS virus. And so we know that genetic warfare is entirely possible, and we know that these people want Africa with its beautiful, pristine beaches, with its diamonds, with its oil, and I think that Africa is being cleared out on purpose right now. So thank you for listening.
I agree. If you just tuned in, you come to the stage tonight. We're talking about the topic Ebola Outbreak, real threat or staged scare tactics. Also, in the second hour, we're going to be talking about the Mike Brown case and what's going on in Ferguson. And as time permits, we're going to talk about abuse in the NFL. I'm Kheri Hines, your host. If you have a question or a comment tonight, get on the phone line. Dial us up at 347-850-8390. I'm going to go to the phone lines. I see 314-381. Good evening. You're on Center Stage.
Hello, Kheri. How you doing?
Hi, how you doing?
Pardon me?
That's fine. How are you?
I'm doing well. Who's that just got you speaking?
That was Mary.
Oh, well, I've heard her before. And I have to give her credit. She's hit on some very accurate points on her discussion.
She's a very smart lady.
Well, I don't agree with everything she say now, but I agree with that. Pardon me?
What did you disagree with?
I say I don't agree with everything she says, but she was on point there. Now, as far as the Ebola, I think it is something to be concerned with.
Mm.
And I think that those countries where it's affecting the most, I can't understand them depending on the United States. Of course, there's other countries that's providing assistance. Cuba, of course, China, and I think Russia may have some people there. You have some countries that have technology and the ability to do things in an effective way. I have always said in my conversations that, African countries need to put in place their own research laboratories in conjunction with the medical colleges and start developing their own medicines and vaccines rather than waiting on the West to do so. Because any time that you can have the Davos conference, which was in, I believe, Switzerland this past spring and summer, where former Vice President Al Gore spoke and complained about Africa's population, when you have people from the United Nations make comments about African population growth, including the leader Ban Ki-moon, how can you expect these same entities to work with any sort of logic, any sort of morals to help prevent a calamity that's killing the population? You have to ask yourself, where's the logic in all that? But it's serious, and yes, there are, and I've heard of race-specific bacteria and race-specific viruses, decades ago, in a conversation about Monsanto as being the topic. And, back during the time of the AIDS appearing on the scene, I had a friend of mine here who wrote to Washington University, a local private university here, and asked Washington University is also a medical school, and asked some questions pertaining to AIDS. And and I can't think of the part of the House bill, a Senate bill that was passed in order to provide funds for the Department of Defense for a biological weapons agent. And I think Mr. Cooper, the author of Behold a Pale Horse, he had excerpts of that particular bill within the pages of his book. So
that was William.
Yes,
William Cooper. Bill Cooper. The name is Bill Cooper or William
I'm
Cooper.
Sorry.
Former
you're absolutely right.
Air Force intelligence officer.
Yeah, he was killed by the government forces. So yes, I do believe that these things do go on. The lady made an error. She said that the population would go from 350 million down to 500 million, and I can understand that area and the excitement. But what else can be said? Hopefully that this will be contained, not allowed to spread too far. I think that the saving grace is going to have to come from that continent itself, rather than waiting on the West to come up with these cures for that. I don't think that's going to happen. After all, Kheri, I don't know about you, but I've been waiting for a cure for sickle cell anemia all my life, and I don't think it's anywhere near on the horizon.
Well, I think the answer in reality, and I've learned this from the Ferguson situation, we as a community keep waiting for somebody to save us. In reality, it's not going to happen. We got to start creating our own and be, I'm not a Muslim, but I have to agree with Muhammad in the fact that black people have got to start being self-sufficient and relying on self and collectively coming together and pooling our resources together to put whatever is needed in our community, because, outside forces, for too long have just proven they're not coming. That's just it in a nutshell. They're just not, and we gotta wake up and get that part. Nobody's going to find a cure for any diseases that are affecting mostly black people, except for people who are concerned, and that's black folks.
Hey, Kheri, I have one thing I'd like to say, is that I understand the guy that was just talking about Africa have to come up with their own solutions, and like you saying, we need to come up with our own solutions. But what's not taking, Carter G. Woodson had the miseducation of the Negro. But see, when you look at Africa, a country that was overtaken and had apartheid, so it hasn't been free that long, not as long as America. So finding your own way is kind of hard when you have no guidance to find your way, because there's no help. Just like us, as far as finding our way into these things, I think they're a test in America. Like Ferguson is a test. All these things are tests for us to see how we can come together and garner a solution to problems that's been problems in this country for years. And we still think carrying a sign or doing some other things is part of the solution and not a true solution. So I think there's tests in America to see how our resolve is, and we have none at the present. We are just, expected to be reactionary like we've always been. So I understand that it's our time to do this, but at some point in time, we have to sit down and make a plan and have people that are willing to stick to the plan and people that are willing to listen to the plan, because everybody have their own plan and they think their plan is the best one. And that's the problem.
Well, I think this is Mark, and I just wanted to say, I think that to comment on what Bianchi and Abiyami just shared is that I think part of the saving grace might come from the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and what they're trying to accomplish with monetary policy and other things. Because the Western powers have shown that they have an agenda which is not in the best interest of the majority of people on this planet, and especially African Americans or Africans in general.
And I agree with that. The issue with depopulation or staving that off, just a couple medical facts. Even though something like prostate cancer that's so prevalent in America, around the world, but in America, over 78% of all men diagnosed with prostate cancer are black men. Over 60% of all incarcerated individuals are black men. And then when you look at the relative number of the non-black population, there is some concern and some reality to individuals that I believe considered not wanting to be the minority versus the majority. And then the other thing that is dealing with that, they're not just using chemical warfare, the food warfare, and so forth amongst the poor. Part of the reason that I believe there was such an uproar about Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act is when you think about it, once again, the CDC. These are all statistics coming out of the CDC. So a lot of things, the relative solution is already on the table. If you take a lot of the diseases, heart disease, diabetes, hypertension, and so forth, if you give people who are willing to go to medical care access to medical and dental care, I can emphatically tell you, if you make the access easier, you will decrease most disease processes by 30 to 40% right off the bat, because they will be diagnosed earlier. People will have better access and better regular visits. But people keep going into all the minutia about what will solve certain things specifically related to disease and disease control. So I think sometimes we get duped, and I think like Kheri said, a lot of times what happens is that something else comes on the forefront, and then the things that we should also keep in alignment with the ongoing social issues, they're kind of like dropped by the wayside because now something else has come up. So I think we have to keep everything in perspective, but we have to remember at the end of the day, the rich are not necessarily trying to help the poor. So the people who are in the struggle and being oppressed do have to come together across color, race, religious lines so that we can do and maximize our efforts to make the social and the socio-economic environment universally better.
Well, and also the greatest, I think, disinfectant for to use a somewhat medical term for the Ebola virus and many other issues that we're facing is what we're doing tonight, and that is by trying to expose the truth about these situations, because the more people that are aware of what the agenda is, what the global agenda is, the better prepared they can be to confront these issues and deal with them in an effective manner.
And another thing too is African countries, and I can name several of them, have the mindset, or should I say, the intelligentsia, whereas they can set up the needed facilities in order to tackle the medical problems that they are faced with today. It's quite evident all over the world. Even their doctors here are some of the most prominent researchers that we have in this country. Even in other countries, look at the team of Nigerians that's working in Ethiopia to help form their medical facilities. But as I mentioned earlier, and I think that people will agree, is that these things have to be looked at from a critical view. I remember years ago, back in maybe the early 80s, I used to read a publication called Baobab Press, and they were talking about sterilization, population control back then. In 1995, Leonard Horowitz wrote a book called Emerging Virus, subtopic about AIDS and Ebola. So what we're seeing is plans. We know that there's biological agents that's created within the War Department, as they used to call it. Now it's the Department of Defense. They're in Fort Detrick, Maryland. Why not? Everybody else have produced these things over the years, crazy things like homosexual viruses and drugs and spraying agents and so forth. So, yes, those things do exist. And people need to become more aware of them and put the things necessary in place so, their underlying devious schemes don't work.
Well, can you hear me? Yes. Can you hear me? Oh, yes. Wonderful. I just want to know, because I hit the star so that my background noise wouldn't disturb anyone. My name is Mary Neal. Now, when it comes to these vaccines, we have got to be careful to make sure that they never come out with an enforced vaccine, because that will be the depopulation vaccine, according to my understanding. They entertained the idea in 2009, and they had to back up off of it. I believe that may be why Michael Jackson was killed. He had a song that he planned to do on his concerts, and it was, "They Don't Care About Us." That song had been censored in America, even though it didn't really have any bad words, it didn't have any nude dancing. There's no reason to censor that song. But he was letting the world know that they don't care about us. And then if you look at that video, you'll notice that he went to South America to make that video, and he used all black people. Now, Michael Jackson, I defy anyone who says he was racially prejudiced. We know he was not. But I think the reason he wanted to use all black people in South America is because he wanted to drive home that of who he was talking about. And then when he said they don't care about us, he leaned on the shoulder of an army man to show you exactly who he was talking about. It was a police officer or a military man. He leaned on his shoulder. So I think that Michael Jackson was going to carry the message to beware of the H1N1 vaccine throughout the world in his concerts. If he had been allowed to even make one concert in that series, that message would have been broadcast all over the world even now. We had Baxter Laboratories set up to make those vaccines for H1N1. We had the government sitting on go to enforce the vaccines. As a matter of fact, the state of Massachusetts had already imposed a concentration camp bill, and they had a law that they actually put in place that said that if an emergency is called, anyone who refuses the H1N1 vaccine would be put in concentration camps, and anyone who got the virus would be put in the same concentration camps. So by hook or crook, you would get H1N1. And so the stocks for Baxter Laboratories shot through the roof when they were getting the contract to make the H1N1 vaccine. Let's look at what the government did. It issued to the manufacturing companies for that vaccine, it issued a waiver. They did not have to worry about litigation against them for anyone who was hurt or killed by the H1N1 vaccine. They did not have to worry about that. They would be absolved from any responsibility, H1N1 vaccines that they created. They did that before they put the vaccine out. Also, your healthcare personnel were absolved of any responsibility for administering the vaccine before it even hit the market. Also, your government was absolved of responsibility for ordering you to take it. They had in place with that H1N1 vaccine, they gave the Department of Health the opportunity to deputize healthcare workers to go down through communities, knock on your door, and insist that everyone in your house and in every house takes that vaccine. They had planned to corner off neighborhood by neighborhood and enforce those shots on everybody. Now let's look at what that vaccine was. It was supposed to be one size fits all. It didn't matter whether you were 100 years old and on 10 medicines, or whether you were pregnant and breastfeeding, or whether you were a healthy teenager. Everybody get the same vaccine. There's no medicine that is the same safety level for every person. Some people would die if they take aspirin. So nobody can make a medicine that is safe for everybody. But they had put out this one-size-fits-all H1N1 vaccine, and they planned to enforce it. As a matter of fact, Massachusetts did pass an enforcement law that you had to take it or go to concentration camps. Now we're in 2014. They have concentration camps set up throughout America. And the president has assigned himself the ability to look at any person or any group of people and say, send them to camp without any criminal charges and without any defense. So we're in the day that has already been done. So be careful of vaccines.
Defense Authorization Act that was signed into law, the Reauthorization Act for the National Defense that was signed into law in 2012, and it has a section in there, Section 1021 and Section 1031, which allows for the indefinite detention of American citizens without trial. I just wanted to throw that in there.
Well, thank you, sir. So I just want you to know that these are very dangerous times. Not everybody has your best interests at heart. And I want you to know that FEMA, I was looking at a film about FEMA the other night, and they announced something that was very disturbing to me. It said that one of FEMA's goals is to protect the status quo. It is to sustain the status quo. Now, you and I know that the status quo is very racist in America. And that is one of the purposes of FEMA, according to this video I watched. And it was also one of the purposes for COINTELPRO, which was a secret FBI program that used 90% of its budget to suppress African Americans' struggle for freedom. So FEMA has that same purpose named according to this video. So let us all be careful and prayerful and don't take any freaking vaccines that you are not hog-tied, shot, and made to take.
I agree. Okay, we gotta kind of move on so we can get to those other two topics. But one thing we want to mention about Ebola before we move on, there was a team of health workers and some journalists that were over there helping to spread the word about Ebola and I guess basically do whatever their jobs were. But it was concerning helping with the Ebola outbreak. And they came up dead. They were found dead yesterday, 9 of them. We understand that there was some journalists and there were also some health workers. So obviously it's gotten very serious over there. They're blaming the deaths on the villagers. Who knows who really did it, but it could have been provocateurs for all we know. But that's what's going on, and that happened in Guinea. So something to think about. And also, one thing we want to mention about the Ebola virus that Mary kind of touched on, as far as the vaccine is concerned, hasn't there been an executive order put in place recently that said that you could be quarantined if you contracted certain illnesses? Was there anybody aware of that? I know I read that somewhere, that there was an executive order put in place that you could be quarantined under a certain situation. We're going to go back to the phone lines. We're going to go to 312-758. Good evening. You're on center stage.
Good evening. This is William Slater from Chicago.
Hi, Mr. Slater.
That, in fact, is actually true.
Okay.
There's been an executive order, and I don't know the number on it, but President Obama has executed an executive order that would permit him to place anybody into CDC governed quarantine facility that is exhibiting respiratory illnesses.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And see, that just happened over in Africa.
Hey, Kheri, it's actually Executive Order 13295, and if you go to whitehouse.gov, it's on there, so it's not a conspiracy theory. Anyway, it's Executive Order Revised List of Quarantinable Communicable Diseases, and it was issued July 31st, 2014. How timely. But it's by the authority vested in me as president, Section 1 amendment to Executive Order 13295, based upon the recommendations of the Secretary of Health and Human Services in consultation with Acting Surgeon General and for the purposes set forth in Section 1 of Executive Order 13295 of April 4, 2003, as amended by Executive Order 13375 of April 1, 2005, Section 1 of Executive Order 13295 shall be further amended by replacing subsection B with the following. The following is B, severe acute respiratory syndromes, which are diseases that are associated with fever and signs of symptoms of pneumonia or other respiratory illness, are capable of being transmitted from person to person, and that either are causing or having the potential to cause a pandemic, or upon infection are highly likely to cause mortality or serious morbidity if not properly controlled. This subsection does not apply to influenza. And it goes on, but basically what they've done is they've amended it so that someone with a respiratory infection can be quarantined. So basically anyone.
And so we just discussed the fact that the UN, basically has quarantined over 6 million people in Sierra Leone, saying that, basically they're trying to, get a grip on the Ebola virus. So therefore we're going to make everybody stay in their house for 3 days, which Christopher basically explained to us earlier. Confining it just makes it worse. So we're in trouble here, y'all. And the fact that, there's an executive order in place, and we know in one of the African countries, I believe it was Guinea, Guinea? That I think at some point they decided that if you were trying to go from one point to another point, there were checkpoints along the way, and they wanted to take your temperature. And if your temperature reached a certain amount, or they say it reached a certain amount, you were automatically put on a bus and shipped to a facility that was housing people that were infected. So this could get very serious very quickly, y'all. I mean, things could shift, on a dime with this Ebola virus, especially with cases having already been brought into the United States. So before we move on, if you have been or know someone who has contracted Ebola, because a lot of our listeners are African, if you are, someone who's living in a village or has family members who's living in a village that has been affected by Ebola, get on the phone lines now. Give us a call at 347-850-8390, and then press 1 once connected. Again, the number to call in is 347-850-8390, and then press 1 once connected. But I think that's the reason we titled tonight's show "Real Threat or Staged Scare Tactic." I think everyone agreed on the panel tonight that it's both. That it is real and it has the potential to kill, but at the same time, I believe they are absolutely using it as a scare tactic, and it really has a lot to do with Agenda 21. And if you are not someone who's familiar with the term Agenda 21, I suggest tonight, after this show, you Google that and learn about it, because this absolutely seems like it has a lot to do with what's going on in Africa right now, and basically them bringing the Ebola-infected individuals back here for treatment. Okay, y'all, we're going to move on. It's already 17 minutes into the second hour.
Kheri, I'm sorry, but I know that being the gentleman that he is, I haven't heard from Abiyami, and there's been a lot said. I would like to hear from him before we move on, if that's okay.
Well, you know what? The problem is I went to him several times, and y'all kept cutting him off. He's dropped off the line. I went to him several times, and y'all kept cutting him off. So I don't know if he lost. Well, so yeah. So I went to him several times. I think if anybody goes back and plays the tape, they'll hear me going to him 3 times, I believe. And someone would always interfere. So I guess he was being a gentleman. If he's still listening, we'd love for him to call back in, but y'all absolutely did not give the guest an opportunity to speak tonight except for one. And I do apologize to him for that. So we're going to bring him back on.
Chicago.
I'm sorry?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Bill Slater again from Chicago. I wanted to make a comment real quick.
Sure.
The gentleman who gave the details on the number of the executive order, I wanted to make a comment, and this is no disrespect to anybody, but he prefaced it by saying, "Oh, this is not a conspiracy theory or anything." I've got news for you. I follow and chase conspiracy theories like a watchdog, and I can tell you that in this day and age, most of everything that I've seen out there, conspiracy theory is not a bad thing. Most of these damn things are true, and to me, it no longer has a shadow over it or a bad connotation. It's things that everybody should be paying attention to.
I agree, and I don't think Mark takes offense to that at all. I think we absolutely agree that there's, most of what we're hearing today, they'll quickly label that's just conspiracy theory. But in fact, when you hear that term, now it should raise a red flag that you should.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I began the show by saying I'm a proud conspiracy theorist, William.
Damn right,
yeah.
Damn right, and my email address is slater@billslater.com, and if anybody wants to connect with me, I will blow your mind with stuff I found out. And I've got free links and free information to a library of stuff.
I'm sorry, your email was Bill Slater what?
No, it's slater@billslater.com.
Yeah, William, Bill, we're friends on Facebook. This is Mark Daniels.
Mark, how you doing, man?
I'm glad you called in. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Slater, for calling in. Okay. So
right on.
We're going to move on to talk about Ferguson. There's a lot going on in Ferguson.
I live in Chicago, and we're laughing at what happened in Ferguson because.
Why would you laugh? Why would you laugh?
Well, the reason we're laughing is because we have Ferguson times 5 about every single week here in Chicago.
Oh, I see what you're saying. And I was born in Chicago, so I absolutely know what you're talking about. And Christopher Bunn's on the line tonight. He lives in the Chicago area as well. So you're absolutely right. There's a lot going on in Chicago. But I think the problem with Chicago is people can't seem to get an understanding of where all the crime is coming from. You know, there's been allegations by one of your older women up there that said that the police may be actually killing some of the people that they're blaming, on gang activity. So there's a lot going on in Chicago,
Oh, sure. We just, yesterday they just indicted, I think the guy's name is Glenn Evans, and he was a Chicago police commander, and he previously had suspensions, and he had, the city had to settle federal judgments in the amount of about $750,000. And this guy was violating the Eighth Amendment of the Constitution, which happens to deal with cruel and unusual punishment, and he stuck a gun barrel in somebody's mouth, and they actually found DNA evidence that corroborated the guy's story. Plus he put a taser on the guy's crotch, and so this guy's in hot water, and he's been assigned a desk job. But we're talking about a guy that reports directly to the superintendent of Chicago Police, and he's in major hot water over abusing citizens who are suspected of crimes.
I mean, Chicago has such corruption. It's like, where do you begin? I mean, seriously, where do you begin? So I think a lot of people, and I'll say this, to your caller, and I'll move on. I think a lot of people are getting it confused as to why so many people have gotten behind the Mike Brown shooting. I don't think Michael Brown is any different than anybody else who's been killed by police. I think the difference is it's just the catalyst. It's just the straw that broke the camel's back. It's just to the point where when people saw that this young man had his hands up and he was surrendering, and yet he was still shot execution style, that just drove it home that it's time to stand up now. And so I think a lot of times I've heard people say exactly what you said, as though people are minimizing the other people that were killed, and that's not the case. It's just the fact that Mike Brown struck a nerve to people who basically have seen police brutality cases one too many times, and this one just let us know that it's time to stand up. So that's all that is. We're going to go to area code 203-443. Good evening. You're on center stage.
It doesn't come up.
203. Hello.
Hi, Kheri. This is Gwen. I'm sorry I have a major cold, so I couldn't participate a little earlier, but I'm in now. Since we're talking about Ferguson.
Oh yeah. Well, we're going to talk about Ferguson because there's a lot going on in Ferguson. We know that there was a city in St. Louis County, Pianki, I think it's still on the line. Pianki can probably tell us a lot about what's going on down there too. There was a city council meeting.
Yes.
With St. Louis County.
Yes. There actually was the gentleman that organized that. He's actually coming to Connecticut. He's for the page of Justice for Mike Brown. So we invited him to an event in California to talk about how they organize that and how other communities who have Ferguson-like situations, which is about injustices. So we're actually having an event.
Who organized that?
So the administrator that he tells me to keep his name private until he's on the form. He's already on the flyer, but he's the administrator for Justice for Mike Brown. So if you go to that page on Facebook that has over 28,000 followers, he has really done an excellent job. I call him the man that kept it alive when the media left. And so when the media finished getting, their moments in time, he's kept the story alive, and they organized it. And so he's going to be talking about that in Connecticut on September 27th, because we're calling our event Ferguson in Connecticut, which just talks about the injustices that's occurring in the communities of color and poor communities. And so he's actually, when I met him, he was at 26,000. I think he's at 28,000. And he gives some good information. He's on the ground, very informed, very balanced, but firm, right? They're looking for justice, and they keep the momentum going on. So, yes. So I would encourage you to go to his page, Justice for Mike Brown. A very, very, very good page.
I've been following it, that Facebook page for a while now. And you're right, I get a lot of very good information from that page. Ferguson, there was a meeting that was said a minute ago in St. Louis County recently, and I think they posted it on Facebook. It got very heated. It seems like, there seems to be, and I'm hoping I'm wrong, and I pray I'm wrong even, because I think it's going to be the tip of the iceberg if they don't do this thing right. But it appears that the people were demanding that the DA, Bob McCullough, step down. They were also demanding the arrest of Officer Darren Wilson. And so, it just seemed like they were talking to, a group of people on the city council who just really seemed to be like they didn't get it, that this is too serious for them not to do the right thing. And so is anybody in agreement with me that this is not going to turn out right if Officer Wilson is not indicted? This is not going to turn out right if DA Bob McCullough allows this to just be swept under the rug like every other, case of police brutality. Does anybody agree with that?
Well, you know what, Kheri, I think it's a powder cake, and I wanted to ask the young lady, the caller. I've heard reports, I haven't read, but I've heard reports that they're actually trying to commute the grand jury review for formal charges to January. They have filed a formal request to commute it to January versus doing it in October. And if that is true, then it sounds like, the fix is already in. I haven't heard of such a move in a case like this where they want to wait now another 4 or 5 months before even considering formal charges.
That's exactly what I've heard as well. And if I was the Justice Department, this is where they have to come in, because I believe it's two things. I believe they're trying to push it out to January because the fix is in, but they're hoping that between the winter weather, I don't know what Missouri does, they're hoping that the momentum that's occurring goes away and that it dies down and the civil actions go away in the community. And then they're hoping that we, like we're stereotyped to do, we usually get riled up and then we go back home, back to family reunions, and then they're going to do this in January, which I think is a dangerous move. I do. If they try to make that official, I think there's going to be civil unrest in many places, not just Ferguson.
Well, I just want to throw this out there real quick. Ma'am, what do you, or in your estimation, would probably be something from your vantage point that folks around the country could do in support of doing more activism in their own community? I know I want you here in Chicago with the violence and the police brutality and police misconduct, but also to support the efforts to keep, because I think helping to keep it alive in Ferguson in terms of advocating for justice will also help around the world, around the nation, in terms of that same motivation and attitude in other cities.
I think this caller is in Connecticut, not Ferguson.
Okay.
Well, what needs to be done, what should be looked at, and what we're looking at here in St. Louis, in the state of Missouri, St. Louis, initiated by these events around St. Louis, is the revision of these state statutes. This is the state statutes that permit the use of deadly force. And as the state statute in Missouri is written, it is very vague, broad, and non-specific. And when these department heads, these municipal heads of police departments interpret those statutes, they come up with rules and regulations that govern the behavior of their employees that are all over the place. And that's why I come, and I've mentioned before, that in Ferguson or Maryland Heights or Clayton, a person in Ferguson can do something, and a person in those other two municipalities can do the very exact thing, and and the results will all be the difference. And we see that in Ferguson. It usually ends up in somebody being shot. And that has, I mean, this thing about when police can consider themselves being under threat, their lives under it, that has to be changed. You can't have, when a police officer can shoot somebody when they're running from them, that has to be changed. And that's the way these statutes, at least the one here in Missouri, is written. And I think that it's probably the same in other states too. Another point, there should be a national registry for police officers, just like it is for rapists, child abusers, and pedophiles. And when they do something where they have to be reprimanded, something that's questionable or something that's unjust, then that information should go in that registry. And people in municipalities where they try to get hired on should know what the heck it is that they're getting involved in.
Yep,
you wouldn't want to be taking someone on as an employee that has caused the previous municipality a $750,000 judgment against them. And one other point, the use, of course, we have, they are going to use the cameras on the dash, the deck, and also on the person of the officer. But it has to be said that these cameras have to be running when an officer initiates a contact with anyone in the public, not if they're at their discretion. Because I have seen cases where the officer didn't turn the camera on. Matter of fact, it was a friend of mine was in trial for a shooting that an officer done not too far from Ferguson on Berkshire Avenue in Davis, where a police officer didn't turn the camera on. This happened back in 2012, and the trial just went on last week. So, these safeguards have to be put in place. They have to be thorough. You can't be short-stopping in order to constrain these officers.
But isn't it the case, and someone brought this to my attention this week, and I've forgotten, I don't know where I put the information, but isn't it the case that police officers, judges, people like that, police departments are immune to prosecution? Isn't there something about that? Isn't there a statute about that?
Well, no, we got cases where police officers already go to jail for doing things. You just had a gentleman talk about it in Chicago that happened. So no, you remember the movie Purpose or something?
Yes. You know what, that is true, but I think the undercurrent to that is that that's not the norm, though. So let's be clear, it's not the norm, and the problem is that until you make it more plausible in federal law, because in each state, they get to determine how they're going to interpret that. The individual that was here in Chicago that was indicted, yes, but that's not the norm. I guess what I'm talking about is that I know that you had mentioned legislation that deals with the use of lethal or excessive force. So I definitely think that's one way. I definitely think that voting and getting the right leadership in is also one of the pieces to the puzzle. But the other has to be, once you get that police officer who basically manipulated or turned the camera off, once you get that police officer who basically it has been proven that they basically used excessive force outside of the normal policy that would have allowed them to do it, then you have to get to the charging piece, which is why we're right back to dealing with Officer Wilson. And we are, because they are deliberating. They know that U.S. Code 42 exists. So it's not so much, it is some of that the prosecuting body is questioning that, but the reason they're questioning it is that they know when they go to court, and if they have a trial and they indict him, and then they have a trial, and then the jury is sitting there, I guarantee you that U.S. Code 42 is going to come up. And based on that code, it's prejudice. And what it basically does is that it gives the judges, it gives the civil authorities, the police, and the state's attorney, district attorney, prosecutorial immunity. And I'm telling you, if we do not address that nugget, we will have another Ferguson, because you do not give the jury anything that they can really do. They may see all the evidence, but they're going to reflect back to that Code 42. So that is, I'm just saying, that is something that is also important that we put on the table.
Keep in mind that codes of federal regulations are up for interpretation. At a federal level, Congress passes an act which becomes a statute, and then the agencies that, I'm not familiar with this code. I know I'm familiar with Code 4026, which is Internal Revenue Service, where the head of the Internal Revenue Service interprets that statute as they best understand it. If a citizen have problem with it, with that interpretation, that's when they go to court. And then the judge will rule if the rule or if the interpretation that the agency, when they put in the rules and regulations, if they are following the statute. So they can be changed.
I agree. And I am in the appellate court dealing with that law now, dealing with that U.S. code now. That's why I bring this up. And I'm in the midst of it and $250,000 of my own money into it because I am telling you emphatically that along with the other things that were said, this would be different if that code was upheld and overturned and changed for better, not just the interpretation, but just a matter of the law. But until we deal with that, this is a shield. The police
and Congress have the ability to change that too. Congress have the ability to revise statutes. They get revised all the time. You just had one here. Well, you got the statute in Indiana that was changed with no knock. If a person is sitting in their living room, they door bust open, they got a right to fire on whoever comes through their door, including the police officers.
See, the thing is, when you think about this case, Mike Brown's case is an absolute test tube baby for people standing up and getting laws changed on the books. That's really how I feel. I think if we don't change them now, they never will change. And I think there's so many things about what went wrong with his case that we can absolutely use as an example of what needs to be changed and revised in these particular laws. First of all, Darren Wilson this week testified before the grand jury. That doesn't typically happen. We understand that Bob McCullough has not even decided what charges he wants to charge Darren Wilson. He's asking the grand jury to come up with a charge. That's ridiculous. Again, we got to go back and demand that certain things go on the book. There should be a protocol in such situations. We shouldn't be trying to figure it out on a case this serious. Would anybody agree with that?
Well, I agree with it, and I have a question for Bianchi. This is Mark. The caller earlier was talking about the fact that, and you had asked the question, Kheri, about them postponing the grand jury until January. And so what I wanted to get Bianchi's opinion about is what does he think about what I think, and I'll ask him what he thinks about it, is that they're postponing it past the November elections.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's why they're doing it, because of the November elections.
I think that's the primary motivator behind putting it in January. You get through the holiday season, the electoral season, and then people have cover, and then they can go to work on trying to, either do what's right or do what they normally do.
But he still is subjected to civil suit also.
But we don't want to do that. We don't want to do that. We don't want to look at every time the officer does wrong that he doesn't face criminal charges, we'll try to get it in the civil court. Well, you're not going to sue him. You're going to sue the city. So he just walks away with a slap on the wrist. Enough of that. That's another reason.
No, he don't just walk away with the.
No, you don't walk away.
He walks away with $500,000 as well.
See, this man. Well, he with the evidence that's presented, and I heard people saying that. Well, the stories didn't collaborate. You got 4 people's story, at least 5 people's stories. I think that collaborate. You have 2 women, the young man that was with Mike Brown, and you have the 2 construction workers, both of which were Caucasian. And the funny thing about it is that they hail from the area where Wilson comes from. Wilson comes from about 25 miles outside of Ferguson, in an area called Crestwood.
Let me jump on that. First of all, we got to stop letting them make us feel like if 5 black people say something, it's still questionable, but one white person say something and that makes it fact. To hell with that.
Well, I heard black folks say that themselves.
And we not to play the race part, but the reality is that if that had been a black cop officer that shot a white alleged assailant, the way that Officer Wilson shot Michael Brown, we wouldn't be having this discussion because he would have been charged already. So there is a racial component to this too, not just that on the table, but the reality is that knowing that should make more of an emphasis on making it universally fair across the board. So when any police officer, and that it is proven that has been caught in misconduct, that they are held accountable. Not that they get a desk job, not that they just get a civil suit, criminal charges. That's what that US 42, that code is all about, because at the end of the day, the registry is great. That's a great idea. I think that's part of the puzzle. But also, there will come a point when a person does something so heinous, they should no longer be a police officer, and they should be brought up on criminal charges, and then if found guilty, they should go to jail. No preferential treatment because you're a police officer.
Now, let me tell you what else happened.
I have the person from Ferguson about to call in. Remember the gentleman that has a Justice for Mike Brown? Because I was telling him, he just called in, and I was telling him there were some questions about January. Could he just give us an up-to-date that he has seen? So I just sent him the number, Kheri. So he's going to be calling into the line. Just if we have any questions.
Another thing, there was another Mike Brown that was killed under similar circumstances, but he was white. And just recently in Independence, Missouri, or maybe it was Defiance, Missouri. I think it's Independence, Missouri.
It was Independence, Bianca. I was just about to bring that up. I'm glad you're doing so.
Yeah, you had a 17-year-old white kid that was pulled over, and he had mechanical problems with his window. The police officer kept telling him to let his window down, and he kept telling him, I'm having problems. So the man opens the door, tased this young kid. Now, you wonder if this kid had been black, he probably would have been shot, but he tased him, then slams him down on the concrete, and now the child is in the hospital with a concussion, unconscious. And Mark, you might correct me if I'm mistaken.
No, you're correct, but here's what happened in that case. The justice system went to work right away on behalf of that young man.
Right.
And that's what's got to change. I mean, I'm so sick and tired of being super sick and tired of doing these same kind of shows, being harassed for doing them, and everybody else isn't standing up. It's time now to realize it's too many examples on the video. You can go on YouTube at any given time and Google police brutality, and you'll find numerous cases. This is rampant. I mean, this ain't gonna stop until we make it stop. I mean,
I think it's important what Christopher brought up earlier about the fact that there are cops that are held accountable, and we do need to highlight those moments when it happens, although it's infrequent. Broward County, Florida, with all the negative attention given to police officers lately, the public is left wondering if there are any good cops left. The bad apples seem to have spoiled the cart, but in Broward County, several cops stepped forward to break the thin blue line in order to turn in one of their own. There's a saying within the anti-police brutality groups that says, I'll believe good cops exist when they start turning in the bad. For Broward County deputies, that day was today. Former Broward County Deputy Eduardo Mesa is accused of stealing from a man that had been killed by a train in January. Mesa is alleged to have stolen the victim's prescription pills. Well, long story short, the guy ends up, he's facing 15 years in prison.
Well, you know what? Let's go here.
So there are.
No, let me jump in there. Why is it that it's easy to indict a cop and get his job when he steals something or rapes a prostitute or does something like that, but it's okay when he kills somebody? So what's wrong with that? Does anybody see a problem besides me?
No, I see it.
Another thing we want to do here in Ferguson, when you get through, Kheri, let me know.
Well, I'm going to get off my soapbox in a second. But we got to reverse this. We got to reverse this. We're looking at it wrong. It is wrong if a cop rapes a prostitute. It is wrong if a cop steals something, while he's on duty, or steals something, period. But at the same time, why is it okay if he kills somebody on duty and we accept the fact that they let him go and they just let him get off and the system just protects him? But at the same time,
the sad thing, Kheri, is we're put in a position now where we're forced to highlight a very few examples of good cops. When I don't think there really are any, but we're forced to do that because we want to at least say, okay, we're not just against cops, we're just against bad cops.
Oh, no, I agree. Center Stage ain't gonna never say she wants to live in a world where there's no police officers, because I believe there's bad in every good, and there's bad in every police. I mean, good in every.
Well,
police
there's one
department.
solution that would solve it all, and that is to get the government out of it altogether. And there's a way to privatize the whole outfit.
Well, that would have to come on back. That would have to come by way of community, which is another demand. And these police officers that we have in these black communities are normally white, and they come from miles around.
Yeah.
Whereas you have high unemployment within these communities.
Absolutely.
So the thing is that the police force, the fire department, any public work the employees on those public works should reflect the people as far as numbers that they're serving. And that has to change. You never will have the type of cohesion that you should have if you got this rampant high unemployment that goes on in these communities that's predominantly African American. And that has to change. Their numbers should be represented on public works, city hall, police department, and the fire department, and also the school district.
Well,
and one thing that's needed.
Frankie, you're a racist, aren't you?
Yeah. Well, I would rather be with my stomach full racist than to be a ravaging, starving dog racist. But let me tell you how this should go.
We
should have.
I know what you're saying.
There should be a hiring agency that has the names of applicants that's qualified, drug tests, meet all the criteria, and these department has to go to this agency when they're ready to hire, rather than picking up the phone and continuing the good old boy system. And then when you question them, they say, well, we couldn't find nobody. Go to this agency. It would be on record that you went to the agency. If the agency cannot produce somebody that's well-trained and so on, then, of course, you can resort to the old method. And also the black community itself should put in training mechanisms like they did coming out of that highway shutdown in 1999, where you created the Met Center, where you have training that goes on for people who wants to improve their skills and be ready for construction jobs. There should be a training mechanism that prepares young people, African-American youth, for these jobs of the fire department, as it revolves around the emergency medical technician certification and also the paramedic certification, as it revolves around the police department, preparing them for that, the same way that the Black Firefighters Union done in the city of St. Louis to prepare applicants for those tests, and thus by you see a parity in the racial makeup of the city of St. Louis Fire Department.
Well, two of the most important points that you've made on this show and then on a previous show is the one you just made, and the other one is when you talked about citizen review boards, and that's something we're trying to do here in Arkansas through the Arkansas Police Accountability Project, is to institute a citizens review board.
Absolutely, and it should be a review board that has teeth that can bring some repercussions for these officers that go out of line. And I'm always for hire local, because once you get off duty, you got to live in the community that you're policing.
Absolutely.
That's true.
Can I say something?
And I think Mary Neal has a comment.
Yes, I have a comment.
Mary Neal, can I say something?
Well, thank you. I just wanted to ask the audience, did you hear or read about the criminal prosecution, in fact, the indictment, grand jury indictment, against former Vice President Dick Cheney and former Attorney General Antonio Gonzalez. They were indicted in 2008 for deliberately withholding federal investigations of murders and abuses in Willacy County, Texas correctional facilities in exchange for good and valuable consideration. Now, the grand jury was presented with evidence that it found to be warranting a criminal indictment against a sitting vice president of the USA and a former attorney general. This was in Willacy County, Texas in 2008. Now, what I submit to you, and I wrote an article about it, I'd appreciate you looking at it, is called Lynching. It's called NSA, Conceals Lynchings. NSA is the National Security Agency, conceals lynchings. What I think that we have happening here is a situation where police departments and certain correctional facilities have paid off individuals in the government in order so that if they kill someone wrongly, they won't be prosecuted. Their police officers won't be prosecuted. Their jail or prison won't be under federal examination. If you look at the cases where we have asked and asked and asked for federal investigations, you will see what I mean. The thing is that, as I said, Willacy County, Texas indicted the sitting vice president and the former attorney general for taking payoffs, kickbacks, to withhold federal investigation. Now, I know that for some, excuse me, I'm not done. I know for some reason my brother, Larry Neal, was secretly arrested and murdered in Memphis Shelby County Jail in Tennessee, and that the federal government, under the United States Department of Justice, helped the jail to avoid accountability for that murder. Look online for wrongful death of Larry Neal. I submit to you in the radio audience here at Center Stage that you should think about the possibility that there's a conspiracy going on between officials in the Justice Department who are taking payoffs and kickbacks, according to this indictment in Willacy County, Texas in 2008, who are taking payoffs to withhold federal investigations even when they're warranted. Because I know that if someone secretly arrests, Larry Neal was not arrested, he was secretly arrested, and then murder a man with mental and physical disabilities after 18 days of secret incarceration, I know that the jail was already under the United States Department of Justice. It had already been placed under that agency's overview. I know that murder deserves investigation. So what I want to submit to you is that when you can't get a federal investigation after these police murders, when you can't get a federal investigation after a town has killed 23 people like Memphis did between 2012 and 2013, when you get trouble getting a federal investigation of blatant abuses against human and civil rights, then I submit to you that what you might want to read about is the 2008 criminal indictment against Vice President Dick Cheney and Antonio Gonzalez that happened in Willacy County, Texas. And I want you to consider that this U.S. DOJ seems to be honoring whatever contract was made to cover up the wrongful death of Larry Neal. So once a deal is made, it passes on through to whoever is the new Attorney General, I believe. So just look online for an article that said NSA conceals lynching. And just think about the possibility of a conspiracy where somebody is being sold protection. Thank you.
Okay, y'all, we're down to our last 5 minutes. Final question. I think I want to piggyback off something somebody said earlier about the prolonging or putting off the indictment or non-indictment of Darren Wilson. I think that's because the holidays is coming up. Everybody gets very friendly and very happy during the holidays. Who's going to be out there marching in the middle of their Thanksgiving? Who's going to be out there marching in the middle of their Christmas? Who's going to be out there marching in the middle of their New Year's Eve celebration? So I think if I remember correctly, it stated it could be any time between now and January 15th or something like that. So we got to be very careful of putting a date on it. They could slip it in at any point. But I think my biggest question is, what happens if they don't indict Darren Wilson? I think now is the time for people to be strategizing and planning. While they're quiet, I think the people that are working, the protesters that are working, should be working quietly as well to counter whatever may come. Be prepared with plan A, B, and C. If they indict him, then there's, whatever course of action. If they don't indict him, then whatever course of action. But I think to sit still and wait for them to make the next move is crazy. I think there should be plan A, B, and C already.
I think they're planning. Kheri, they're planning. For what I'm understanding, they are planning. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, there are plans. One thing, the man is should not be continue to be hired by the city of Ferguson because people do not have confidence in him. I've seen where this one lady, Miss Aaron, who was the first fire chief for Northeast Fire District, she was black coming out of U City, and she was making changes, and all the firefighters got together, majority of whites, and voted no confidence, and it kind of disturbed her quite a bit. She ended up resigning. But one thing, he cannot work, in that community no more. The community don't have any confidence. The funny thing about it, he came from Jennings, which is an adjacent community, and the police department in Jennings was 99% white, and the people in Jennings, the black population in Jennings, which is the majority, kept complaining to the city council about police brutality, and apparently the city council, the mayor, talked with the police chief of Jennings Police Department and tried to make those changes, which he did not happen. And they just dissolved the police department. And when that dissolving came about, you seen Wilson go from Jennings to Ferguson. Right. Now, if the activities that was going on with the Jennings Police Department that was so horrendous that blacks was coming out in groves complaining, Wilson had to be influenced by that, at least. And that type of animosity followed him to where he ended up there in Ferguson. And like the other person say, the police talk about, you hear about there's only a few bad apples in police force. Well, if that's the case, then why don't the majority who's not bad apples correct and get rid of the few bad ones?
Amen.
That gets back to that same old thing where people sit on their ass. And, Mark, I may not be talking about you, but white folks need to get off their fat asses and take care of some of these problems. For instance, like illegal immigrants in the southern border.
There's a few of us, like myself, that are doing that, but there's not enough.
And I agree with you. I know there are.
But they're changing also what's happening down there because there's a Democratic committee who doesn't have no confidence in their whatever this group is. So they changed themselves to the Fannie Lou Hamer party. So whatever's happening in Ferguson or in St. Louis, Missouri, it's changing.
I've seen that. Yes, you're absolutely right.
They're drawing lines in the sand, and that's what we're hoping to do. So if anyone's in the Connecticut area or the tri-state area, please join us in Ferguson and Connecticut September 27th in Norwalk, because we'll be talking about these very issues, because we want to learn from the Fergusons, not necessarily wanting to repeat the tragedy, but to show what it is when we come together as a community, as a majority, regardless of what color you are, right, the human race, to improve the conditions in our communities. That's what we're doing in Connecticut on the 27th of September.
What is the next big event in Ferguson? I mean, what's in the works?
Well, I've got a crowd. I've got an audience I speak to tomorrow it's not going to be a big event, but I'm speaking to them on this very issue. I've been invited to, so there's always something going on.
We appreciate everything you're doing, Bianchi.
Well, I tell you what, I'm not getting out on them. I'm very appreciative of these young people that's telling the old people, look, you didn't get it right back then, so we're not going to chance you now. We're going to try to get. So what I do is try to consult them. That this is what you should say and this is the direction that you should go. There's several groups out there. They're all trying to, make a difference, and that is good. It's a lot of diverse groups. But the young people need direction, and, from my experiences, I think that I can at least share with them those experiences so they don't repeat any past, errors.
I agree.
Well, you're a wise person, and I think it's important to have people like you imparting your wisdom to the young folks so that, things go in the right direction.
And one thing I'm handing out tomorrow, United States Constitution.
There you go. So are we.
You go, man. You go.
Because that is it. If that is what your protection is, right there.
And I think that, we're going to close out with that, I think that's very important too. I think whenever you have an enemy, I think the first thing you must do is study your enemy and then understand the enemy's playbook. That's the only way you're going to defeat an enemy. And so I think Bianchi has a great point. The Constitution, you have rights under the Constitution, and you should be able to recite them when you are stopped by a police officer as to what your rights are. You need to be able to understand that you have the right to ask him a question, am I being detained? I do not agree, that you can search my car. You need to be able to let him know that you understand that you have rights. You have the right to take pictures. You have the right to use your camera to record the incident. You have those rights. And so I think those are things that we need to start realizing, and then we need to use a paper and a pen sometimes. Marching is wonderful, and I think the protesters in Ferguson should be commended. I really do. I think they absolutely brought more power to what they did in those days of marching than, anything we've seen since the Civil Rights Movement. But at the same time, I think the next phase is using the enemy's playbook against the enemy. And I think we all know what that is, going to the court system, going to the polls, doing it like they do it. Okay, y'all, this is going to be the final comment. I'd like to say to my guest tonight, thank you so much, Mary Neal. And I apologize to my guest, Mr. Abayami Azakiwe. He's the editor of Pan American News Wire. I went to him, and I would love for him to go back and listen to the tape. I went to him 3 times, but somebody kept cutting him off. So I apologize, and he's going to come back, and we're going to do a show on the condition in the state of Detroit right now. So he will be back, but I apologize for tonight. I really, really do. Also, a reminder, the views and opinions of our guests do not necessarily reflect that of Center Stage, the host, or advertisers. Also, a reminder, we are here each and every Friday night from 8 to 10 p.m. Central, 9 to 11 Eastern. This is what we do. If you have a show idea that you'd like to see us do, drop us a line at centerstageradio@yahoo.com. That's centerstageradio@yahoo.com. And if it's in line with the type shows that we do, we will definitely look at covering that. Also, tell a friend, tell a neighbor, tell a coworker to check out the show. Again, we're here each and every Friday night from 8 to 10 p.m. Central, 9 to 11 Eastern. Listen, we've gone into overtime. We got to get out of here. We'll see you next week, same time, same back channel. Bye-bye.